And a couple of quick announcements, too. I wanted to say today's discussion is going to be about realignment, of course, and AB 109 and the state's decision to shift about 34,000 or so inmates from state responsibility to local responsibility, which took effect just a couple weeks ago. This is a new area of study for PPIC. We've done work in public safety before, but we have this year really started to launch a major effort in studying public safety in California, particularly starting with realignment. So one of our first steps was to write the paper that you're about to hear presented by Dean Misczynski. We're also putting together a research team on this that will include Magnus Lofstrom, who's a policy fellow at PPIC, and we've just brought on Joan Peter-Celia, who's the co-director of the Stanford Criminal Justice Center, and has done a lot of work in this area, and she's going to be a contract consultant to PPIC to help us put together, how best we might be able to contribute to the issues going ahead on this on realignment and public safety. So just very quickly, just to summarize how things will work today. I'm going to introduce Dean Misczynski, who is a adjunct policy fellow at PPIC, and he is going to give about a 10-minute presentation about the paper that he just released about realignment and the overcrowding issues that led to the state's decision on AB 109, some of the elements of AB 109, and then some of the issues that are raised by this change. And then we'll get to a panel discussion with some top experts and very distinguished contributors who can help us resolve some of the questions raised by this issue and tell us where we are now and what we might expect on the horizon. So with that, let me introduce Dean Misczynski. Dean is retired from the California Research Bureau in 2008 after about 30 years in state government. He also did assignments in the state Senate and with the Office of Planning and Research, and he has done a number of papers for PPIC on fiscal issues and infrastructure and now realignment. So welcome, Dean.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much. Correctional realignment sounds like something you would go see your chiropractor about, but that isn't right. So I'm going to spend a few minutes giving you a little bit of background about realignment, giving you a brief description of what the state did, giving you some idea of why they did it, giving you some idea of how local governments are likely to react, and just list a couple of loose ends that I think are interesting. So background, realignment. Dates back at least to President Reagan, who, remember, talked about, no, you probably don't, but talked about new federalism, talked about the devolution of authority from the federal government to the states, on the theory that given a certain amount of freedom, the states could do better. The states could do more with less. And therefore, the syllogism was, therefore, the feds could cut budgets for the states, could reduce grants to the states. That sort of syllogism is inherent in realignment, and you can understand what Reagan did either as a well-thought-out, reasoned public policy initiative, or as a kind of a dodge, a way of reducing state budgets. So California's first experiment with realignment on a large scale was in 1991. It was a time of recession, the Pete Wilson recession. It was a time when a lot of programs were being cut, especially social service programs, especially mental health. And so the idea arose, okay, we're going to do something about mental health. We're going to realign it. We're going to increase the sales tax. We're going to increase the vehicle license fee funding. We're going to put that money in a special fund, and it will only be available to send to local governments, and therefore it doesn't have to go into the state's general fund and isn't subject to Proposition 98. If it went into the general fund, 45% of the new money would have to go to schools. By putting it in a special fund, we didn't have to do that. That somewhat strange bit of plumbing was sufficient to persuade enough Republicans to support this idea. It made it look a little Reagan-esque, and it passed and became law. Now, fast forward to 2011. The governor, in the January budget, proposes essentially the same transaction. We will continue a sales tax increase. We will continue a VLF surcharge. We'll put the money in a special fund available only to locals. We'll go around Prop 98. And the money will be for public safety programs, broadly understood, to include child welfare and adult protective and other programs, but in particular, and the only one that really got realigned, to include corrections. In 2011, the Republicans were, let's say, more clear thinking in their views about taxes, and they didn't go along with it. Now, what they did, in California, in most states, I guess, if you commit a significant crime, it's called a felony. If you commit a felony, it used to be the case that you went to state prison. You served your time in state prison. When you had finished serving your time, you were released on parole for more or less 3 years, depending on whether you were good or bad. And you were supervised by a state parole agent. What realignment does is it creates a new class of felony. You could call it a felony light, consisting of people who commit crimes which are non-serious, non-violent, non-sexual, non-non-nons, or non-cubes, among some people who play this game. And if you commit a crime which is a non-cube crime, instead of going to state prison, you go to county jail. If you commit a crime which is a non-cube crime and you serve your time, you go to, not to parole, as you used to, but to county supervision, called Post-Release Community Supervision, or PERCS. I don't know what the acronym will turn out to be. There are different numbers about this, but the numbers that the Department of Finance was using say that the effect of this is that about 26,000 prisoners will end up going not to prison but to jail, and about 60,000 completed prisoners will serve their time, their supervision time under post-release community supervision. That's what they did. Why did they do it? Well, the most important reason is starting in the 1990s, the state was sued a couple of times on the grounds that its mental health and then later its health care were so bad that they constituted cruel and unusual punishment in violation of the Eighth Amendment. And time passed, decades, and improvements weren't made on the scale that the courts wanted. In the last couple of years, a federal 3-judge panel decided that the only way that the state was going to make progress with its health care and mental health care problems was to reduce the level of overcrowding in the state prisons. At one point, it reached 200%. So they concluded that the state would have to offload about 34,000 prisoners within 2 years. By happy convenience, the realignment gets rid of, well, 26,000. Originally, it was going to be more, almost exactly what we're supposed to get rid of, not quite. Now, there's a second state reason for doing this, and that is there is some belief in the core idea of realignment, which is that the locals can do it better. Counties arguably have a greater stake in the outcome of how prisoners are treated because, after all, they return to the county, to the community. Counties run social service programs that could make a big difference in rehabilitating prisoners. They run drug and alcohol treatment programs. They run mental health programs. They have some control over housing programs. They have some control over educational programs and job training programs. If they incorporated those programs into the correctional system, they could have the effect of causing far more prisoners to not be recidivism cases, to be rehabilitated, to become normal, well-adjusted citizens. So those are the reasons why the state did it. What will the locals do? Well, start with this. They won't, by and large, just put these 26,000 prisoners in jail, because, by and large, jails are full. A number of jails around the state are under court orders with population caps. A number are under self-imposed population caps. A few have extra room. Instead of putting them in jail, well, I guess I should qualify that. It's conceivable that a county could put all of the new prisoners in jail, but in order to do that, they would have to release a similar number of their existing prisoners to make the space. What they're supposed to do, that is what the legislation suggests, and what the financing plan certainly reinforces, is to not do what the state did, which is to just lock the people up for the period of their sentence, but to do other things, to do alternative sanctions, to keep them in their homes, to use GPS bracelets, to keep them in drug treatment programs, to keep them under intensive supervision. There's a long list of possible alternative sanctions. So that's what they're supposed to do. Almost certainly some counties will lean in the direction of doing their very best to keep everyone locked up to the maximum possible. And some will go as far as they can in the direction of rehabilitation programs. And we've got 58 counties, and we're going to have 58 responses and outcomes. And that's either frightening or cool, depending on how you look at it. I think it's very interesting. It creates a vast experiment in correctional policy, probably the largest that we've seen in this country. Now, a few loose ends. One set of loose ends has to do with the legal vulnerability of correctional realignment. It can be and may be attacked on a number of grounds. One is Prop 98, this business of running the money not through the general fund, but around the general fund and into a special fund and then to the locals, and therefore it not being subject to Prop 98 is arguable, hardly bomb-proof, so if a court said, oh, well, this is illegal and this money is subject to Prop 98 too, it would mean that the state would have to, in some sense, divert about $2.5 billion of the dollars that are going to realignment into school funding and come up with another $2.5 billion for realignment. Another vulnerability is the state mandate issue. Remember, the Constitution says if the state mandates that local governments do this or that, the state has to reimburse the locals. The legal theory of realignment is the Constitution has an exception to the mandate requirement if the state changes the definition of crimes. And the the realignment legislation is written in such a way that it appears to be a long series of changes in the definition of crime, so that instead of being a felony that results in going to state prison, it's a felony that results in going to jail. That doesn't really work for the parole part of this. It doesn't work for other parts, and it may not work there. I think that's a vulnerability. If the counties pursued that claim and won, the consequence would be the state would either have to reimburse for the full cost that the counties are incurring, or the state would have to suspend the mandate, which I guess means take back the prisoners. We've never gotten into this kind of world before. This is Brave New World stuff. And another possible legal vulnerability is the state is into trouble because its health care is inadequate. Counties have not had that kind of litigation to anything like the extent of the state because people stay in county jails for a much shorter period of time. And so the health and mental health problems aren't as severe. But to the degree that counties start getting state prisoners with longer jail terms, they may be subject to similar health attack. And in that case, well, it's hard to imagine exactly what the consequences would be. A second kind of loose end that I'd just like to list is this is a vast experiment, and we really ought to be learning from it as much as we possibly can. That, to me, means we ought to be evaluating what happens. There are at least 4 areas that I would suggest we think about evaluation. One has to do with crime rates. Compared to what we used to do, keeping people locked up in state prison, realignment will almost certainly result in an increase in crime rate. I hate to say that in a way because I know it can be used, but it's still true. It's not a useful comparison because keeping people locked up in state prison as we used to is something we can't do. The courts have said that. So the options are different. We can release 34,000 prisoners. We can do something like realignment and ask the counties to manage them in some cleverer way than the state does. We can build new prisons and jails, but not quickly enough. At any rate, understanding what the effect of realignment is on crime rates, not just in some gross overall sense that can be used in a soundbite, but specifically, what kinds of people are committing the crimes? How are they? Are they in home incarceration? Are they in a drug program? How are they being handled at the time? What crimes were they in for in the first place? We need to know that kind of stuff to adjust the program as we go along. So that's one. A second area has to do with equity. One function of the state has always been to maintain a certain level of equity in programs around the state. Inherent in realignment is the idea that we're going to tolerate less equity. We're going to let 58 counties do their thing with these prisoners. And we know that these 58 counties have very different attitudes about how to treat prisoners. There are going to be very different outcomes in counties around the state. We at least need to keep track of that. Well, there are any number of other things to evaluate, but I'm probably over my time. So thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Dean. As we get to our panel, I just wanted to share just a couple of quick thoughts to put some context to the next part of our discussion. I mean, one of the things that's been striking to me about the debate on this, and obviously this is an issue that's been in the news a lot lately, is the striking dissimilarity in some of the comments we're seeing from public officials. In Los Angeles, Sheriff Baca was a big supporter who stood with the governor when AB 109 was signed, and in Los Angeles, Supervisor Yaroslavsky has called this something that could be a political revolution. And we saw, last week there was a letter from mayors who were unhappy with the plan, but also a lot of the associations representing local officials who are supportive of the plan. And then lastly, I just there were a couple of sheriffs here in the area, Sacramento and Solano County, who both spoke in Sacramento recently, but with very different impressions about what might happen. One was the Solano County sheriff, who said that we should have done this 10 years ago, maybe 20. We've been going down the wrong path for a long time, and we can do this. And then the Sacramento County sheriff wrote in the Bee the same week, nobody can sincerely argue that crime will go down under realignment. More offenders on the street with little or no supervision, coupled with a statistical certainty of recidivism rate of about 70%, leads to a logical conclusion of more crime. So I think obviously this is a very big change, and naturally with uncertainty and some apprehension or anxiety would follow a big change like this, and that is why we're here today, to talk about what exactly the change is, what's happening right now, and to look ahead at what we think might happen in coming months. So to do that, we have a very distinguished and expert panel that we'll hear from. I'll introduce them now and then get to a couple questions, and then we'll take some questions from the audience. First is Matt Cate, Secretary of the Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation. Matt's been with the department since 2008 and previously was Inspector General for the state of California. He was also a state and local prosecutor with over a decade with the Attorney General's office supervising criminal trials, and also with the Deputy District Attorney for the Sacramento County. And previous to that was a litigation attorney with Downey Brand Seymour Rower. Next is Elizabeth Howard Espinosa, who is a legislative representative at CSAC, the California State Association of Counties. Since 1999, she's worked there on a number of public safety-related areas like juvenile justice and trial court funding and corrections reform. And previously, she was a policy analyst with the Judicial Council at the Administrative Office of the Courts. And then Dean, and on the end there is Karen Pank, who is Executive Director of the Chief Probation Officers of California. Karen is a partner at Warner & Pank, which is a strategic planning and consulting firm. And previously, she was a Deputy Legislative Secretary for Governor Schwarzenegger on criminal justice issues, and also a consultant to the Assembly and Senate Republican Caucus on public safety issues. So we have a very good panel to cover a variety of different questions in this area, and I wanted to start out first with Secretary Cate, but just bringing us up to date on what's happening right now, what is your office doing right now, and kind of in that context, how are you responding to the many questions or concerns or expectations that are out there?
Well, thank you for having me. The Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation is working on two fronts, really. One is to implement the new law, and so we're doing things like working with the counties and the probation chiefs to set up a liaison at every prison to answer questions and make sure the transfers are going well, to working with the county mental health directors to ensure that the information they're receiving about offenders who have some history of mental illness is being transferred appropriately to make sure we have the right continuum of care. We're working with the sheriffs on dealing with issues concerning everything from funding to capacity to tips on how to handle longer-term offenders and how to defend lawsuits. We're dealing with the counties on funding, and meanwhile we're working internally to ensure that all of our processes are working appropriately during this. And at the same time, myself and a few others are touring the state to continue to talk about what realignment is and isn't, to try to make sure that people are all working on the same set of facts, and to try to listen for what people are most concerned about, whether those are government officials or citizens, and to make sure that we're being responsive to those concerns. So that's kind of what's happening right now in corrections.
Thank you. Elizabeth, how about with CSAC, and what are you hearing from the counties, and what's the activity right now that you're dealing with most?
Well, excuse me, I have a bit of a frog in my throat today. We are about, I guess, 2 or 3 weeks into the implementation of AB 109. And remember, of course, that realignment actually goes far beyond just the correctional piece. So counties broadly are attempting to figure out the various pieces of realignment. I would say that some of the counties are approaching the criminal justice realignment portion with a shorter term view, figuring out how they're going to manage the new offenders for the short term, and taking a little bit more time to sort out how they're going to adapt their systems and their culture to incorporate these new populations in their community over the long term. I think one caution I would just suggest to this group and to the others is that we can't expect fundamental and foundational change over time. This does represent a very significant policy change. Some counties perhaps are more ready to take on this change than others. And there will be bumps in the road. There will be things that we will see in the newspaper that we'll need to respond to, and we need to be prepared to respond to those. But I think none of us are in a position, really, we don't have the luxury of retreating from this path. There is really no path without risk. We have from the highest court in the nation, we have really no ability to escape an order that the state prison population must be reduced by a certain number of prisoners and over a 2-year period of time. And I think that counties understand that AB 109, the realignment of offenders, is our best chance to have an orderly transition, to have resources to come with the offenders. The alternative would be to have these folks released from prison without resources. So I think we appreciate the fact that we are given an opportunity to demonstrate some successes with this population. Of course, I would be remiss if I didn't state that counties entered the discussion about realignment with an understanding that there would be a new revenue source dedicated to it and it would be constitutionally protected. As we all know, that's not how it turned out. So we are, at the same time as implementing realignment, pursuing all options to secure constitutional protections for the funding that's to support realignment for the short term and the long term. So that's where we are. We're busy, I'll tell you that.
Yeah, thank you, Elizabeth. And Karen, how about CPOC?
Well, as both Secretary Cate and Elizabeth just shared, we have been working really in a team effort to undergo this rather large transition in policy in California, probably the largest in many of our history in this area of law. So I definitely think there's a lot on our hands. We're very busy, as Elizabeth said. We've been working really closely, specifically with the Department of Corrections, on the transition, trying to understand who is coming out on that post-release community supervision new category, and that Dean kind of went over earlier. We're also working locally within our counties and across stakeholder groups within the Community Corrections Partnership process, which was also established by the legislation to try and adjust our systems to be ready for this change. And I think that's really one of the biggest differences in this particular change than in maybe other states that we've seen before. I know Dean referred to it as a vast experiment, and that's a really scary moniker, I would submit. And in some cases that's very true, but in others, when you look at what other states have been doing over the past 20 years, they've looked at a lot of this similar type of policy change. And even if you look within California, what we did on the juvenile level, especially in probation, when properly funded, we can do things different to hopefully get a hold of this 70% recidivism rate. I mean, there's victims behind those numbers, and we believe it's important to try to change that, not only the conversation, but to change that reality. So I think in a perfect world, and I think that's why it is a bit of a vast experiment, is that we're going to have potentially 58 different experiments. The California legislation definitely gives locals the chance to look at their own system and adjust it to what the people in your county want. At least ideally, that's the concept. And then we can measure those things and make adjustments as we go forward. I'm not sure other states have done it quite in that way. So from that perspective, I think that'll be new. But I do think we have, at least again in the probation world, a little bit of history, both in some of the changes we've seen in the juvenile arena here in California over the last 20 years, and in order to try to bring down those crime rates in the juvenile area. We also saw just recently, we do supervise this population now in our communities locally. Probation has a large felony probation population now. So these are the same types of people. In many cases, they're even more concerning, let's say. So we've been working with these people for a long time, and when there was some funds federally just 2 years ago to put into probation to try to make a difference with this population and that recidivism rate, we were able to, I think, save the state about $179 million in incarceration rates, because if you're successful on felony probation, you don't go to state prison. If you're not successful on felony probation, you do. So we were able to find more successes with those felony probationers. And I think that we're hopeful we'll be able to do a lot of the same thing. Again, if the funds are there and protected, that is an outstanding question in this debate. But all of the efforts that we've been doing thus far have been kind of driving towards that goal.
Karen, I wanted to stay with you for just another question, but we've seen in Los Angeles and in Sacramento and elsewhere a debate as this starts to take effect between it's been seen as between the sheriffs and the probation department, but it's about a real question about whether money should go to rehabilitation or whether it should go to police and jail beds. Mm-hmm. And I wonder, from your perspective, is that an either-or choice, or and do you expect going forward that we're going to see a variety of different choices about counties that go one way or the other?
I do think you'll see a variety of choices. The early indications from the plans that have gone through the entire process, and we term that the ones who've gone through to the Board of Supervisors' approval. There's been about 26, 28 as of today. And what we have seen, just kind of generally speaking, is it is about half and half. We see about half of the funding going to probation, half of the funding going to sheriff departments. That's a little bit of a misnomer as well, because of course there are other pieces of the justice system that are probably going to be impacted. And what will happen in many of those cases is that the sheriff and or probation might be buying some further services within the counties. And so, I kind of use those percentages loosely. So I do think you will see a difference. I don't think they're mutually exclusive. I think, we're talking about each county will have different situations. Some counties have no beds to open or staff at your jail at this time, and so you'll need to be more creative as to how to manage that population. Other counties will want to really invest in community corrections and in the supervision and ensuring that those who are not behind bars have appropriate supervision and programs attached to that to get to the rehabilitation. What we have found at the state association level is that in most cases, all of those stakeholders are working well together and trying to come up with solutions. I do think you tend to hear about when there are fights. Those make much better news stories. So that's going to happen because this is a very big change in our system.
Thanks. And I just wanted to jump to Secretary Cate along some of the same lines, but I saw you speak at a conference, I think the week before last, that was hosted by, co-hosted by CSAC and CPOC and the Sheriff's Association, and you talked about being there. The state will be there to help the counties and to help local government as it implements this plan. What does that mean in terms of these kinds of choices that the counties are having to make, and what kind of responses are you hearing, and I guess what can the state do to help?
Well, that comment comes from my basic belief that there's a false dichotomy between local, county, and state government that I think is propped up more by politicians than people. Frankly, if you live in Sacramento, the city here, you have a house somewhere in Midtown, let's say. You're also a part of the county, and you get services from them, and you also happen to be a citizen of the state. And so to try to pit one government organization against another, I think doesn't really fit for the people who live and work here. I think what's important is all three branches have to work. They all have to be successful. And so, our hope has been that we're going to allow for the fact that there are really smart, hardworking, policy-minded people in local government who can make really good decisions. And so I don't think we need, as a state, to push down every policy decisions, even in criminal justice. So that's part of it. The other part, though, is that we've crafted realignment together. When realignment was rolled out in January, parole was going to end. The state was going to pocket that $1 billion, and that was it. That was parole realignment. And there was a significant pushback from the county saying, we're not ready for that. we think there is a role. And so we began to have a conversation about that $1 billion that we were spending on parole, and we started talking about, all right, well then, let's divide it this way. And I just use this as an example to say, in the end, the state kept the serious violent and high-risk sex offenders, and the counties kept the remainder on community supervision, so that everybody's supervised. You should know nationwide, only 65% of people are supervised. We're supervising everyone here. And yet, there's still this massive concern. I could go on and on about the concerns, whether they're rational or contrived. But the point is that that we're not going to stop that discussion today. We're going to try to continue to say we want local governments to have local control. If there are parts of this that really cannot be addressed, that could be better only with state intervention, then I know the governor has said that, at least for the part of the administration, we'll be here to listen. And if there's things we can do to make it better, we're here to do that. But most things, there is a tendency, we have to be careful about one side of the local continuum coming and saying, we want you to fix this at the expense of the other. That's what you see most often, and we want to try to avoid that if we can.
Elizabeth, I wonder, on the same kind of area, what are the choices that you see at the supervisors' table? I mean, what are they having to make these kinds of difficult choices, and what are you hearing?
Well, I think a theme that you're hearing, too, is part of realignment is getting comfortable with the notion that people are going to do things differently. Dean addressed that a bit in his opening comments. And I think, frankly, that's county supervisors' preference. They operate in an environment where they need to be responsive to their voters and their constituents, and they need to put together a plan, certainly with the input of their local criminal justice partners who make up the Community Corrections Partnership. But presumably what they do in the first year may evolve over time, and it may look very different in year 2, year 3, year 4, and year 5. I don't think we necessarily know how everyone's going to react to realignment, and we've been living this for longer than this year, certainly, but I am just fascinated by how much it's being talked about. I can't get in the car and turn on the radio without hearing about realignment. So it's very interesting. I think we do have a couple challenges, obviously. I think one of them, again, part of realignment is we're being given responsibility, authority, and some funding to run programs at the local level that meet local needs. But we also, as a collection of 58 counties who may do things differently, we need to agree on what are the elements that we're going to track so we can demonstrate success. We need to, show our constituents, our voters, the people in this state, that we can do a better job at the local level. We don't want to be overly burdened with a complicated set of reporting requirements, but I do think we need to track some key factors so that we can demonstrate over time what we're doing with this money that's coming to us rather than going to the state. I think another difference just from the Board of Supervisors level is that I think all of us who work in this area, we have to resist a little bit the tendency to consider this in a silo. Realignment is only a piece of what counties do. We know these offenders. They've gone through our systems. We know their families. We know what happens to people who touch the the child welfare or foster care system. 70% of those people go on and become part of the adult correctional system. So part of realignment is a challenge to think about the families that we're already serving and how does realignment change that or perhaps not change that, and how do we use those monies to invest across systems so we can fundamentally make a difference in individual people's lives so that they don't go down a path that leads to their being incarcerated. I think that, as big as that might seem, I think that is our fundamental challenge, but if we can do well at that, if that is our shared objective, we will be making a very historic difference, potentially in lots of people's lives and in what as all of our taxpayer money is being invested in.
So, Dean, just in your study of this topic, are there crucial choices that are on the table right now that people need to be making?
You're asking me?
What are they? Yes.
Oh. Well, the discussion was over the legislative year, and this is the normal period of hiatus when all the discussions kind of go underground. And So I'm not hearing intense discussion. I know that there are some subjects that are beginning to surface, like the original planning for realignment had in mind that these would be people that were in jail for 2-3 year sentences, and the actual time they'd spend in jail would be less than that. At least the county sheriffs are beginning to say that some of the people that are arriving in the first busloads are people with 6, 8. There's one county that claims they're the first person to arrive at a 21-year sentence. Now, I can't imagine what a non with a 21-year sentence did. But if any of those stories are true, then it suggests that there's going to need to be some adjustment about which prisoners are going to the counties so that the sentences are kind of manageable in a jail environment. That's one thing. There's been talk about whether the level of sanctions that are allowed for managing what used to be parole people are sufficient to, actually get them to behave. And that's a question that we're going to learn about from experience and presumably make adjustments about. There are lots and lots of issues having to do with whether the money is enough or not. And, partially that's just something that local governments do, state agencies do. But with some experience, we're going to learn about whether the level of funding is sufficient or not, and maybe make some changes there. There are probably other things.
Well, you're segueing right to I want to get to at least one more question before we go to the audience, but it has to be about what we are in the funding. And Elizabeth, why don't I start with you? I mean, obviously there's funding for this first year. That we've seen a lot of questions or concern about, what happens beyond that. And so what are you hearing from supervisors? What are you telling them? And what activities in terms of securing the funding are you doing for CSAC?
Yes. Well, the funding, just at least in terms of the first year allocation, there is an allocation formula that exists in statute, although the funding just mechanically is continuously appropriated. What we don't have, though, is constitutional protection for that funding source on an ongoing basis, and that's what we're currently pursuing. I think ideally, obviously, I'm certain the group knows that to make a change to the Constitution, you need to go to the voters, but I think the path and timing of that, whether there's a large coalition of folks who join into that we trust would be led by the governor, and I know he's continuing to make his plans. For our purposes, though, we feel like we need to assure and create our own path in the absence of some larger coalition coming together and coalescing around a particular approach. So we are making plans up to and including going to the voters via the signature gathering route. That's what we've been given direction to do by our board of directors. So we're in the process of doing all the things you need to do. This is sort of a new area for me, but you have to poll and figure out what people are willing to do and not do. And so that's what we're engaged in right now.
Could I ask a follow-up to that, please?
Sure.
Sorry, this is just curiosity, but
Certainly.
the bill the constitutional amendment that was proposed to the legislature did a couple of things. One is to guarantee local funding. Mm-hmm. Okay, you like that. And the other was to establish that nothing about realignment would be considered a state mandate and trigger any of the mandate requirements. Do you see those two things as an essential part of a package or not?
Well, I'll say this. That was a negotiated agreement with the administration, and I think that's the trade-off that we agreed to as part of realignment. So the idea is that if you're given a constitutional guarantee, which is not a guarantee that we certainly enjoy that's not always the case, but in the 1991 realignment that you referenced earlier, we don't have a constitutional guarantee for the funding. There are a series of poison pills that create incentives for us not to go back on the deal, but we certainly think that constitutional protection for a realignment of this size, remembering, of course, that there is a significant health and human services portion of realignment that really eclipses the size of the criminal justice realignment in terms of sheer dollars. We believe that constitutional protection is essential, and in exchange for getting that constitutional protection, we were willing to say to the administration, we won't seek a mandate claim if the money doesn't, fully cover every, dollar that we spend on realignment. That's just kind of one of the principles that we agreed to.
So I wanted to get to you, Secretary Cate, on the same question. I mean, obviously at this conference the week before last, the governor guaranteed that funding would be there, that he would do whatever he could to get it there. I'm sure you're hearing concerns about the funding as well. I just wonder going forward, how are you responding to local officials about that question, and what are you doing, and how do you see the funding issue going forward?
Well, again, trying to make sure we're on the same page factually is important. There's a continuous appropriation in the legislation, which people don't seem to remember. I read today, in fact, in a news article that talked about the fact that the state had only decided to fund 9 of 12 months of realignment, when in fact there's only 9 months left in the year when realignment started. And so, it's a little rough. We do want the constitutional amendment, and the governor has said he will go forward with everything he has to get that. He has also said he'll veto a budget that doesn't fully fund realignment. And every sheriff I've talked to and every probation chief I've talked to have said they believe him. Now we'll see. It could get really tough to veto a budget because maybe the economy does a double dip, and maybe all of a sudden there isn't half the money we thought there would be, and whatnot. But the governor's promise in those circumstances is that we'll have to sit back down at the table, and then maybe you have to renegotiate what the counties are expected to do and what the state is expected to do under those circumstances. But that kind of goes back again to this idea of partnership. The economy goes sour, we're all in the same boat. Part of the reason that this is so challenging is the counties and cities are struggling financially at the same time the state is. And so, I think we have to, again, just do everything we can to lock in those dollars, but be ready to work together regardless of the circumstances.
Thanks. And Karen Pank, I just wanted to ask about probation. Obviously, in realignment, there is a high expectation in probation. I mean, a lot of hopefully interventions that will reduce recidivism and mitigate whatever negative effect there might be. How is the issue of funding and the uncertainty about it affecting what's happening in probation?
It's probably the biggest problem right now in implementing realignment, in that as our boards of supervisors are nervous that the funding isn't established in the way that we originally entered the agreement. It makes them a little more concerned fiscally about maybe devoting the dollars to some of these long-term strategies and infrastructure that we really need to build into our systems to be successful. So, I think the things that the governor has been saying to all of the local officials and in the public right now, CSAC's efforts to secure a constitutional amendment is critical, because otherwise you are looking at year over year or half fiscal year over half fiscal year of what you are going to be doing to invest those dollars in a way that will show success and good outcomes, and that's very difficult to do. That's very difficult budget planning when you're trying to change a system to be more responsive to the types of offenders you will be managing. So I think it would be probably one of the #1 issues that we would have in implementation. We've spent a lot of time over the past several years kind of being prepared to deploy new strategies to be successful with our current population. Those strategies, in large part, are transferable to this new population that we will be dealing with in realignment. So I think we know what tools we need in the toolkit. We just need to ensure that we have the funds to buy them.
And Elizabeth, did you say the effort there was signature gathering was underway or being prepared for?
No, not just yet. We're going up to that point, and we will be seeking the approval of our board of directors at the end of November, early part of December, if we're going to move to that point. But we're doing all of the investigatory steps up to that point right now.
And is that being done with the governor's office or with the administration?
This is a realignment that's sort of only standalone measure at this point.
So let me open it up to questions. I'm sure there's plenty. Yeah, right back there.
My name, do you want us to do that?
Please, yes, thank
My name
you.
is David Warren, Director of Food and Public Safety. I'm counting on others to ask about healthcare and rehabilitation. So my question is that when you're transferring all these inmates out, you're going to have significant RLUIPA issues at the county level because there's lack of facilities because they were never designed for that, and that invites a loss of federal funding for the counties. How are the counties going to address that?
Let's see.
Right,
Elizabeth,
we've talked to our county council. I think we're prepared. You know, our folks are confident that our jails we're subject to litigation right now for our jails. Our jails weren't necessarily designed for a longer term population, but I think we're prepared to take the steps necessary, you know, to ensure that we're compliant to the extent that resources allow us to be. So there are many challenges. That's probably one of them, but our folks are looking at all of the issues that may be coming our way.
Yeah, Secretary Cate?
I just wanted to, I know David knows this, he probably used this term loosely, but there is no transfer.
Right.
And so I do want to make sure people are aware of that. We got calls literally from 20 television news stations, no offense to anybody who's in TV journalism, asking where they can get video footage of the buses leaving the prisons and going to the counties. And we're very disappointed when we said there are no buses. No one is transferring either from parole or from the prisons to the counties. This is a prospective, going forward basis. It begins with a trickle, only with new convictions and new releases. So, and then the other thing I would say is that keep in mind there's 10,000 empty jail beds right now. Lee Baca has 4,500 in L.A. that he can't open because he doesn't have the funding. And so it's going to be a difficult issue for local government. Do you fund those jails? Margaret Mims in Fresno just opened 850 new jail beds with realignment funding. And so you'll have that debate. We also, I think, need to expand fire camps for these inmates. That's a great way to handle long-term inmates. And there's contracting back, which we're trying to work out, which again deals with financing issues. And so I just would note that, again, we want to make sure we're clear on our understandings.
Could you respond to the health care issue? Obviously, that was one of the drivers that led to us to the situation we're in now. How does realignment affect health care at the local level and the state level?
Well, on the short-term offenders, it's really a huge, what we do currently is a huge waste in that we have 47,000 offenders who served 90 days or less last year. And of that 47,000, they averaged, a little less really than those 90 days. And so we spend the majority of our time and effort on doing screening and treatment for medical, mental health, dental, ADA, developmentally disabled care, all of those kinds of things. And then we release them immediately back out to the county. The people we're keeping are going to be the most ill. So we see that prisoners age, as far as their physical health, quicker than other citizens tend to. And so the state will end up keeping the most mentally ill and the most physically ill in prison because they're serving the longest terms. There will be some uptick, obviously, in the counties, but we don't think it'll be exactly the same proportion.
Thank you. And there's a question right here. Yes.
Yeah, there's two parts. So these non-crimes, have they always drawn state time? And two, because they're non-crimes, assuming that these people were always going to get out at some point. So I guess how much time is being shaved off their state time and going into the community?
Again, if I could,
Sure.
and Dean may want to weigh in on this.
Yeah, the question was how much of these non-crimes have gone to the state previously, and how much less time.
Been crimes that draw state time, and then because they're non, one would assume these people were always going to get out of state prison at some point. So going into the future, how much time will be, quote, shaved off versus time in state prison?
So just a couple points on that, and then I'm free to, obviously, I'll give the floor if others want to answer it. But your question is, I think, a very important one. Keep in mind that not all felons went to prison. In fact, the last statistic I read showed that half of felons people who are convicted of felonies, they go on probation. They go on felony probation. And so these were people that were going to be at the local level anyway. 95% of offenders who go to prison come back to their communities at some point in the future, so these people were coming back. So those two things, I think, are important to keep in mind. The other is, I think we have to be very careful when we talk about crime rate, because crime's been going down for about 20 years, and I can't get two people to agree on why. I just went to a big event at USC, and these researchers were convinced that 3 strikes had nothing to do with it. And you talk to Steve Cooley, who's the DA, and he's convinced it had everything to do with it. And the mayor in Los Angeles talked about a concern about crime going up in L.A. I just saw crime had gone up the week before realignment in L.A., and as far as number of arrests. And so it is really complicated. And so with a 70% recidivism rate, our hope is that we do see a reduction in these repeat short-term offenders, and we'll keep our eye on long-term crime rates. But I just think we should all, at least folks who are involved in the research, should just be very careful about drawing conclusions too soon about really complicated issues.
And do you want to speak? Sorry, Karen.
Well, I would just add that to the sentencing question, that there was no change in the time. So the sentence time is still the same. They're eligible for what they're eligible for. The change in realignment is where they will be serving that time. So again, just kind of to dovetail on to Secretary Cate's comments.
Dean, do you want to talk to the populations and where they're serving and what they're not?
Well, I agree that it's a very good question. And since I initially found this sort of obscure, let me just amplify a little bit of what the Secretary said. If you're convicted of a felony in a county court, the court has the option of sending you to state prison or of putting you on probation, with the provision that if you screw up probation, you're going to prison. And as I understand it, about 70% of the felons are put on probation rather than being sent to state prison. So realignment only kicks in once the persons would have been sent to state prison. If a person is sent to state prison for a term of, let's say, 2 years or less, the Department of Finance financing plan provides enough money to keep that person in jail for 6 months. And then there's money to do other things that are cheaper. So there's no legal requirement that the person not spend the full 2 years, if that's the sentence, locked up. But the financial incentives very strongly encourage the county to do something else after 6 months or whatever. That's the average. But I certainly agree. It's how this is going to work is very complicated. A lot of moving parts.
Part of the answer is still under development. I got a question back here. And then
Rebecca Blanton of the California Research Bureau. You've talked about this as an experiment. What's being done to gather data across the counties and align that with the data from CDCR?
I think everybody else here should answer that question.
Well, we've begun a working group. So, in the great tradition of governments, it includes the Department of Justice. They gather the statistics from the courts. Court clerks enter information that so-and-so was arrested and convicted for such and such. And then that information goes to DOJ, and then CDCR also has data that we gather and utilize for making policy decisions. And then individual counties have their own databases in many cases. And so we've begun to work together to talk about what information do we need to gather so that you folks can utilize it to draw conclusions and to write papers and to lead debates about what part of this has been successful and which parts could be improved.
Karen, what about evaluation and testing, how this is working?
Well, we are participating in the work group, of course, and trying to figure out how you measure some of this. There really wasn't a provision statutorily put in to measure, and obviously there are costs associated with that. So I think what we're trying to figure out is, what do we have now? What do we quote unquote count now in order to provide some evaluation somewhere down the line? You're also measuring 58 different county and court responses in some cases, so there will be that level of difficulty. The other thing is you may be able to pull down data and compare it to the previous system pre-realignment, but it'll be very difficult to potentially measure what would have happened post the U.S. Supreme Court decision. So you're kind of trying to measure a negative. I think that many of us in the local arena are very hopeful that we can improve on the 70% recidivism rate, but that's really not the only question. And so how you kind of frame success or evaluate things that need to be changed is also a complex question.
It's very, Elizabeth, do you ever thought about that? How do you know if this worked?
Yeah, that is going to be difficult because, as Karen indicated, and I think we stated earlier, we think realignment is a better alternative than allowing the order of the 3-judge panel to be put into place without any plan. And realignment gives an opportunity to plan and put some resources behind programming. So it is going to be difficult, and as Karen indicated, we need to have something that is doable across 58 counties and that can give us something that is allows us to compare the efforts that each county is undertaking, but that can produce some ability to say, are outcomes better? Are our communities safer? Are the offenders who we are providing services to doing a better job and making a contribution? Are they keeping a job? But how you do that from county to county, there isn't something in the construct of realignment that tells counties exactly what they need to track. And I do think this is one of the big questions that we're going to need to tackle in this first year following realignment, the implementation of realignment.
Thank you. I have a question right here.
Thanks. Alan Hopper from the ACLU. We've been meeting with county level officials across the state talking about implementation of realignment, and one of the concerns we've heard expressed in several counties is about the current funding formula sort of being weighted toward providing more funding for counties that have traditionally sent more people to state prison. So counties who feel like they've been doing a good job before realignment in terms of figuring out alternative ways of dealing with this low-level criminal offender behavior than state prison feel like they've been sort of punished a little bit. And so my question is, in the discussions that you've been having, Elizabeth, about a ballot initiative for funding, constitutionally protecting the funding source, are those discussions focused on, and is the idea of a ballot initiative focused on protecting the overall pot of money through time, or are you thinking about, constitutionally protecting the current funding formula, or is the idea to leave that open to be adjusted over time as you see what works better or worse?
So the question is about the funding formula that we have now and whether it might be changed in a ballot measure by CSAC and to have different rewards for counties. Elizabeth, do you want to?
Well, my response, what comes to mind is I can't think of a worse idea than locking an allocation formula into the Constitution. So no, we're not planning on locking an allocation formula into the Constitution. One of the lessons learned from the 91 realignment is we need to have some ability to adjust allocation formulas, which is just the mechanism and the means by which you divvy up the dollars to 58 counties. We had county administrative officers, a working group involved in putting together the allocation formula. It's a very difficult discussion no matter what the program and no matter the size of the dollars. It's just difficult when you're doing a sub-state allocation to 58 counties who do things differently. So the lesson learned from 91 is there was no provision for the allocation formulas to adjust for changes in law, changes in caseload, changes in population growth. So we are very cognizant of the fact that you want some flexibility in the funding formula, and that is why there's only a 9-month allocation formula, which people regrettably have interpreted as 9 months of funding, period, end of story, and that's not the case as we've discussed. Just for a minute on the allocation, the consensus decision on how to allocate the money for the first 9 months was to weight the biggest piece on basically a proxy for counties' caseload. That's Department of Finance, their estimate of how many new offenders counties would be dealing with in their community at the full rollout, full implementation. So it's a proxy for caseload. The two other pieces that we incorporated to sort of smooth out some very strange results that were produced by just looking at the caseload impact were 30% of the county's adult population, just their straight census numbers, 18 to 64. Could we have used 18 to 25 or 18 to 35? Yes, but these are not low-level offenders. You may have some older people who have drug issues that lead to criminality, so we decided to go with the 18 to 64. And then 10% based on counties' performance under the Probation Incentive Program, which was SB 678, a bill by Senator Leno from 2 years ago that Karen referenced, where counties were given some money up front to start some programming for felony adult probationers. And based on our success under that program, we were able to share in the savings that the state enjoyed because we have reduced the new commitments to state prison. The argument you will hear is there are those counties who do have a big caseload for whatever reason. I think it's we could spend a lot of time talking about the different reasons why counties make decisions. And it's not just the county. You have courts and lots of elected officials who are involved in those decisions. But those counties have the population coming. They will argue that they need the resources to manage the folks that they're not managing now. What's also difficult is those counties who have a low population impact or caseload impact compared to their straight population. It was really hard to tell why. There was not a good reason that we could suss out that would indicate why any given county who you would think would have a fairly big population impact coming back to them wasn't having that impact. And there was really no factor that we could identify that you could apply equally and equitably across 58 counties to address perhaps investments in alternatives to incarceration from the general fund that the county was already undertaking. There's nothing you could capture to say this is what every county's doing and put that into a formula. So that's why we incorporated, 40% is pretty significant. We incorporated two other factors to kind of balance out the 60% of caseload, and that's where we ended up. But it's only for 9 months, and we probably after the first of the year will undertake discussions in earnest about how you approach year 2 and beyond.
So, Karen, I wonder from probation's perspective about the current funding formula and what might be done going forward.
Well, we have kind of a similar issue as Elizabeth referred to. I mean, you'll have some of our counties that feel like that formula is fair and a good way to measure this forward because it's something tangible. We have a caseload coming that we know and need to be ready to address immediately in order to ensure public safety. And then you have counties that feel like we've already been making investments perhaps locally and therefore we shouldn't be punished because we're ahead of the game, And so it's something that we're going to have to balance out. CSAC has been working on this formula for many, many months, and that's how we came up with the first formula. And so I suspect we'll be looking at all the factors, going forward, including, what do we learn from these first 9 months, and should there be some adjustments made, to help, incentivize appropriate behavior. And so I think that all of those things we expect to have a conversation about, but we have the same problem that CSAC does right now. Quite just honestly, we have some people who like it the way it is, and some people are going to want to see a change. Mm-hmm.
Questions? Yes, right there. You say who you are and where you're from?
My name is Michael Manaski. I live here in Sacramento County. I have a question for Secretary Cate. You said, I can't find experts to agree on why crime rates have dropped. Then maybe you can answer, why do we incarcerate so many people at such a high rate, the highest in the world?
The question is why we don't have experts who can agree on why the rate has dropped and what the crime rate or the incarceration rate is now.
Well,
no, but my question is why the crime rate is so high, not only in California but in the United States, that we have not the crime rate, rather, I'm sorry, the incarceration rate. That's what
yeah, well, I don't know. I know that California's we're in the middle right now. We're about 25th, 26th in the country as far as our incarceration rates in California. I hear all of people talking about the economy driving crime rates, and I think that hasn't been shown to be true. The economy's been terrible, and crime rates have continued to go down. We see states and countries that haven't implemented 3 strikes and whose incarceration rates haven't gone up, and they've also enjoyed a reduction in crime rates. And yet, there is some. I can tell you that as a former prosecutor, I used 3 strikes to put some really some folks that were just hell-bent on a crime spree away for a long time, and I felt like that was fine. In fact, that was I figured that's what we needed to do. So, anecdotally, at least it feels good, to want to do that. But and I think there's definitely some guys who need that. But that's just my view. I don't know the answer to your question though on the broad scheme. Maybe Dean or someone else would have a better.
Any other thoughts about our incarceration rate or crime rate?
The crime rate is an utter mystery and a fascinating one. I think you can fairly say that California has a taste for punishment that's a little higher than some other states. And part of our problem is that we don't have a taste for paying for it. And that's what caused the court to say we had to release prisoners.
Other questions? Yes, right here.
Hi, Suzanne Reed, Chief of Staff Officer Carol Lou, and we represent parts of Los Angeles County. Our question about information and communication. And we have a number of local cities who initially had some concerns based on the kinds of information they were getting or the lack thereof in their own websites. So I wanted to emphasize the importance of the communication and this cross integration with the other programs that are going on, but also ask in terms of, as we go forward, even without a precise evaluation system, are there going to be lines of communication and information exchange that are going to allow best practices to be disseminated throughout the system? And so if we're going to do this 50 experiments, if we can at least capitalize on the results and the outcomes in a productive way.
Thank you. Yeah, the question is about communication with local officials and especially going forward and sharing best practices. I know there's a lot of training going on. Karen Pank, why don't you?
Yeah, thanks. If I could, in fact, it's one of the things that is just something that we're working on a daily, hourly, and all-encompassing basis, because our group's belief is that we continue to share knowledge with this experiment, although I would like to get away from the experiment moniker, because it sounds like we're making some uneducated guesses and changes in policy, and I think we do have some information and science that will show us how best to deal with this. And so in addition to continuing to train, so we're kind of ensuring that our training is a little more robust on some of these issues. We're working collaboratively with CSAC, the State Sheriff's Association, and other county associations. There was some training funds put into the this year's budget for us to do that, and that was the real purpose, to try to ensure that we are talking to each other between the counties. And then we communicate a lot. Secretary Cate's probably sick of my voice. I know we communicate quite a bit as to with his staff regarding how things are going. And what we have found is that even though we're all in the corrections world, we do speak a different language. The state and the county languages are different. And I think when we went to put in the process, which has taken months and months to do, it took that much time to really do some translation between the two. And I think we continue in those communication efforts, and corrections really has been very open, more so than I have ever seen in my career, in trying to work through some of those issues, not to be confused with, like Elizabeth said, there's going to be bumps in the road when you're making this big of a change. But I would have to say that the communication between counties, at least at our association level, and then with the various associations, and then with the state, is at a historic high. So that would be my comment.
Elizabeth, can you respond to that too? And also, local police chiefs were brought up in the question. Are the city level involved in this discussion as well, and training?
At the local level, the city police chiefs have a role in the Community Corrections Partnership, and I think that's an important place for that discussion to happen. I think it certainly is a role for statewide associations in the training. But in terms of some of these questions about local communication, we keep reminding folks, you've got to talk to folks locally, and we're certainly willing and able, and will continue to coordinate and collaborate with the statewide associations. But some of this has to happen at the local level, because I certainly can't keep track of what all the 58 counties are doing. But just in terms of the best practices, and Secretary Cate can probably speak to this more fluently than I can, but part of one of the budget trailer bills also revamped, for lack of a better word, the Correction Standards Authority. And beginning July 1, that board and authority will take on a new name. It will be, the composition of the board will be slightly different, and it will be charged with having a coordinating role between, and the Board of Correction Standards Authority has a long history in the state-local relationship, but that the new State Board of Community Corrections has a role in helping with the implementation of criminal justice realignment and creating a clearinghouse and sharing information across counties and between counties in the state. So I think that's one area where we all will be interested in focusing our interest and our input, so that board and the staff of the new Board of Community Corrections is best positioned to fulfill that role in a way that is useful for all of us who are doing the work at the local level.
So, and Secretary Cate, I know you're out there because we were on a flight to Burbank at 6:30 in the morning on Thursday, and you were headed to a realignment speech and discussion. Can you talk about what you're doing in terms of communication, and why is it important now, and how you're getting out ahead of some of the misinformation you've been talking about?
Sure. So, it's really more than just that. I can never resist clearing up, mistaken facts about realignment. But it's more than just making sure the facts are right. It's also about where's our best hope. And frankly, one of the reasons the governor has confidence in realignment is that he has confidence in local law enforcement. And so, we were recently meeting with the probation chiefs, and I looked at them and said, I blame you for all this. And in jest, I say this because in truth, it is our confidence that if properly funded, probation chiefs know what they're doing. We have seen, especially in the last few years, a significant increase in the amount of knowledge sharing among the chiefs. The kind of evidence-based practices they're employing is very impressive. I talk to the sheriffs now, and the vast majority of the sheriffs, in fact, I don't hear anybody telling me, well, rehabilitation doesn't work anymore. I mean, that used to be a common theme. I don't hear anybody saying that. And so I try to get that message across that, the truth is local law enforcement believes it can get this done. In fact, I have yet to meet with a community corrections partnership, that group of law enforcement officials who I'll put it in a positive. Every one of those people I've talked to have told me, yes, we think we can do a better job than the state at reducing recidivism and protecting our communities. Every one of them. And so some of it is just making sure that local communities understand your leaders are confident they can get this done. Now, it has to be properly funded. You hear that from Sheriff Jones. The cities are concerned about the additional police work, and there's some debate about how much role there is in that, and a lot of this needs to be worked through. But it's that message of is that your leaders have confidence and you should have confidence in them that I'm trying to get out.
Thank you very much. Well, we are at the end of our time, and I wanted to say just a very sincere thank you to the wonderful panel and for all of you for coming. So please. See you again next time.